Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, the waiting game between Israel and Iran.
I think this is a delaying game to get everything in place with the Americans, what we're seeing now, to have the infrastructure in place for Iran's response to what Israel is going to do.
Now, the U.S. is sending anti-missile defense systems to Israel and U.S. troops to operate them. What's next? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take.
I'm Stephanie Dekker, Senior Correspondent with Al Jazeera English, and my job is to be roving basically out of Doha, but we cover all kinds of stories around the world.
Which means you are covering what we're talking about today. Stephanie, over the weekend, the U.S. Pentagon announced it will be shipping an advanced anti-missile system to Israel and sending troops along with it. What does this development mean?
Well, it means the Americans, they are already involved, right? They've said, we will stand by Israel to the end. What this means is that, you're going to have troops on the ground to operate the THAAD, they call it, this anti-missile system. But, it does, I feel, change the dynamic somewhat. If troops get hit, for example, if it already enters them really into this sort of, stage of war, which we are at, like however you want to frame it, right? There is a war going on. However it escalates is a different matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Pentagon said on Sunday that it was to help bolster Israel's air defenses following Iran's unprecedented attacks against Israel on April 13th and again on October 1st. What they didn't mention are Israel's attacks. So this story, depending on how you look at it, could start so very many places. But what is happening here with this U.S. insertion of this anti-missile system is in the midst of these tensions between Israel and Iran, with, of course, Gaza and the war in Gaza as the backdrop. So can you remind us briefly, if that's even possible, how we got to this stage?
I think you put it really well when you said, there's so many moving parts. I think it boils down to Gaza. It boils down to October the 7th, the attack by Hamas on Israel. Israel hit Gaza, saying it is going to eliminate Hamas. It has eliminated all of Gaza, its life, its fabric of society. But Hezbollah entered the fray on the 8th of October. Now, Hezbollah and Hamas are seen as proxies of Iran. So for Israel, and particularly for Benjamin Netanyahu, Iran has always been public enemy number one, the threat to Israel's existence. And it sees these groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, and others, as responsible, and Iran being responsible for all it has faced. And like you said, we only talk about what the Americans say or Israel says in terms of what gets hit in Israel, but Israel has been flattening Gaza, flattening Lebanon, all under the guise of self-defense and survival. If you look at the breaches that it's done, the intelligence breach on Hezbollah, it's been beyond huge, something no one really could imagine. And even targeting, for example, Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas's political leadership in Tehran. And you haven't had the kind of response I think most people would expect, either from Hezbollah or Iran, on Israel.
Interesting. Well, that explains why, at least in U.S. headlines, there is much talk about this Hezbollah drone strike that we saw happen this weekend on an Israeli army base near the central city of Binyamina, where at least 4 soldiers were killed and dozens injured in Israel.
Israeli military officials say more than 100 rockets were launched from Hezbollah. The Israeli city of Haifa was hit for the first time in 18 years.
Dozens of ambulances and military helicopters were seen evacuating the injured from the army base. It's the deadliest drone attack Hezbollah has carried out against Israel in over a year.
So Hezbollah says this attack was in retaliation for Israel's strike on Beirut on Thursday, which killed 22 people, injured more than 100. This deadly tit for tat, how will this play out then in Israel? And does that automatically up the ante for direct conflict with Iran?
Well, Israel has said, and it's apparently told the Americans, that it's going to hit back hard for that particular hit on the Golani Brigade, which is an elite part of the Israeli army, if you will. Again, Hezbollah is targeting military, right? Military troops, military installations. It's something that it's always said it has done. In the past, there's been different hits, but we're still within those parameters. It hasn't fired massive barrages at Tel Aviv or at heavily populated places. You hear about Haifa all the time. Why? Haifa has a naval base. There's military bases around there. It's a very significant strategic place that hosts a lot of military infrastructure. I don't think you're going to see Israel hitting Iran directly for that, but I think, to be honest, they already know what they're going to hit. There's all this talk about we're still looking at targets. I think this is a delaying game to get everything in place with the Americans, what we're seeing now, to have the infrastructure in place for Iran's response to what Israel is going to do.
Oh, wow. Oh, okay. So let me
It's
just
complicated.
take a step back from that. Yeah, it really is. So the U.S. has to be in place to protect its ally, which means Israel can't really react or act before that system is in place and that support is in place.
I think at this point, Israel needs the Americans because it is aware that Iran has capabilities that it hasn't shown. Even though there, of course, have been tensions with the Americans because, this administration called for a ceasefire in Gaza for so long, and Netanyahu decided that wasn't what he wanted. So just before they hit Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's Secretary General, the Americans had said, we're working on a 3-week cessation of hostilities to try and get some form of ceasefire to stop this from escalating. You had such backlash from the Israeli government, basically threatening to collapse Netanyahu's government, his ministers, threatening to resign over this because they want to go all guns blazing. So he changed his tune once he got off the plane. This all happened so fast. So what I'm trying to say is that the Americans have put all of these pressures on Israel not to do what it has simply done. It also said, we don't want a ground invasion in Lebanon. And they have gone ahead to do it anyway. So now what you're seeing is the Americans telling them, don't hit nuclear, don't hit oil. But they're still coming to Israel's defense and help and getting everything into place for when that day happens. And we're going to have to wait and see what the targets will be.
After the break, how the U.S. and countries in the region could shape Israel's response. So, Stephanie, Iran's attack on October 1st across Israel followed a number of assassinations, you mentioned them, by Israel of Hamas's leader, Ismail Haniyeh, Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah in Lebanon. You actually saw Iran's response to those assassinations and other attacks on Israel on October 1st. Can you remind us of what that was like? What did you see? What happened?
Yes, it was extraordinary. We were operating because we've been kicked out of Israel. We could not report there. So we're operating from Amman, the Jordanian capital. And it was evening and I was leaving the office and on my phone, we got an alert saying Iran launches missiles at Israel. And you saw these slow flying balls of red gold. It was like a highway above our heads to Israel. And then you had some interceptions. Jordan was intercepting and American, we also believe were intercepting. So you could hear that. But it went on for about half an hour. They were landing in the occupied West Bank. They hit close to the Mosaad headquarters in Tel Aviv, which is what they were aimed at, the Mossad headquarters and military bases. But it was extraordinary to witness, and also because we knew the significance of what was happening. I've seen so many times rockets fired out of Gaza flying over our heads, but this just has such more of a massive dimension to it.
Why? Because it is Iran directly, not an Iran ally or an Iran proxy?
Absolutely. I mean, as you said, all that changed in April. And I do think we should go back again. Like you mentioned, it started fine with October the 7th, but then it really escalated when Israel hit Fuad Shukr, who was one of Hezbollah's main military commanders in Beirut, in Dahya, in the southern suburb. 12 hours later or so, they assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas, in Tehran, which is a loss of face for the Iranians not to be able to keep him safe. And it just escalated from there. The pager and walkie-talkies explosions, which were, again, something out of a spy movie. And having breached to that extent a group that is so secretive and meticulous in trying to keep its members, its Secretary General, its operatives, away from such breaches, right? And then the systematic assassination and targeting almost on a day-by-day level of military commanders, political commanders, intelligence commanders, heads of missile systems that Hezbollah over time hasn't been able to dismantle has been extraordinary. So when you ask about the significance, I think everything has changed because, as you say, before it was regional, it was a proxy war. It was done by its groups in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Yemen. And April was the first time you saw a direct targeting of Iran onto Israel and Israel hitting back at Iran as well. But it was small. It was a missile defense of a nuclear site. So there was a message, but everything at that point changed. The rules had changed.
The U.S. has been warning of this changing rules, so to speak, this widening war since the very beginning. Since October, we've heard Biden warn Iran and warn other players not to make this a bigger regional war.
Now is the time for the parties to finalize its terms, bring the hostages home, and secure security for Israel and Gaza free of Hamas' grip, ease the suffering in Gaza, and end this war. On October 7th, since October 7th, we've also been determined to prevent a wider war that engulfs the entire region.
And yet, seeing the U.S. now bolster its ally Israel, as it's done throughout the entirety of this war, what then does that mean? What does that mean for the Biden administration? What does that mean for the U.S.'s claims that they don't want this to be a wider regional war? Are we already at that wider regional war?
Yes, we are. Most definitely. I think, I can answer that as a journalist and trying not to sort of move away from the impartiality. But, in the beginning, we would hear about ceasefire talks in Gaza, and we've been covering this for a year now. And at some point I was quite hopeful and we debated with colleagues, do you think this time we're going to get a ceasefire? No, the Americans, the pressure on Netanyahu, blah, blah, blah. And like the things we were talking about earlier, right? Like they wanted a 3-week cessation of hostilities in Lebanon. They didn't want a ground invasion. Netanyahu has done whatever he wanted, disregarding the pressure from the Americans. At the same time, as you mentioned there, with the Americans footing the bill for all of it. So whether he listens, certainly one thing is clear. He's never had the opportunity that he has right now when it comes to targeting Iran. And it's something that has always been a priority for Benjamin Netanyahu throughout the decades of his political career.
Okay, so we've talked about the U.S. Let's talk about the other players in this, and that's the Gulf countries. As far as Israel's retaliation, we know that Iran has said that hitting its oil or nuclear targets is a red line. The U.S. has also warned against this, the energy sector and the oil sector. And according to a report from Reuters, Gulf states are lobbying the U.S. to stop Israel from attacking Iran's oil sites as well. Is that pressure having any impact on de-escalating? And what does that mean for the fact that the Gulf states are now involving themselves?
Well, obviously there is going to be a global effect on oil prices, right? If they do strike Iran's oil, and this is also why the Americans are really trying to stop that. There were leaks a couple of weeks ago from very well-placed sources in Israel, but this was very much on the table, Iran's oil facilities. So this is where this is coming from. And of course, the Gulf countries don't want this either because of the global oil economy. Now, it is complicated because the Gulf countries, many of them, are not that unhappy with what is happening. They're not great fans of Iran, if we're going to be honest, right? So the removal of Hassan Nasrallah, I'm sure behind closed doors, wasn't mourned in many capitals of Gulf countries. So you get this very complicated political situation that has changed. You used to have Arab countries that would shun Israel unless there's a Palestinian state. We do not deal with. All that has changed over the last couple of years. A lot of these countries, have the Abraham Accords, have deals with Israel, will say, okay, we have all these economic deals on the table, but we'll only really do that once there's a Palestinian state. As always with politics, Malika, what happens under the table and what we don't know is often really what matters. And often we don't know this. So I've learned that for sure, so in terms of how much pressure that is going to put on Netanyahu on what he's going to strike, I think these days he's pretty much off leash. It's the best situation. They have a list. And I think what Israel wants now is to end the wars of attrition with Hamas, with Hezbollah, with Iran. October the 7th shook them to such an extent, to their very core of security, that for all of Israel, even if you are kind of left or used to be, let's put it that way, this is about a matter of survival.
Wow. Okay, so then if not the oil and the energy sites, without asking you to pontificate too much, I do think that the question is, what would this attack look like? Because Israel's security cabinet met on Thursday, the 10th, to vote on Israel's response to Iran's October 1st missile attack. We've heard Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, say that their attack on Iran would be deadly, precise, and surprising. So, surprising being the key word there, you don't know. But those you're talking to, what are the fears of what this attack could look like?
The worst fear is that they hit nuclear facilities. And there's a lot of support for that. I remember reporting just last week, and I asked our producers to get a sense of the Hebrew media, what they were saying. And the headlines that were relayed to me were, Bibi, which is Netanyahu's nickname, Bibi, go nuclear. We are behind you. There was, and I was surprised too. There was such a sort of mass support for him to take out. Remember, 12 years ago, he stood at the UN General Assembly and had that bomb. That many people joked because it was such a childlike. Well, Iran for him has always been
a drawing of a bomb.
Exactly.
So how much enriched uranium do you need for a bomb? And how close is Iran to getting it? Well, let me show you. Brought a diagram for you. Here's a diagram. This is a bomb. This is a fuse.
It's always been the main priority for him. So that's the worst case scenario. Some people will tell you that he doesn't want to do that. He wants the Americans fully in to get involved to the extent that you see regime change, that you see, these kinds of changes, which in the past have happened in different countries, right? I think what the Americans say publicly is they want proportionality. What that means, what that would have to mean, is that they strike military targets like the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, these kinds of targets, because that is what Iran targeted in their attacks, military targets.
Bibi, go nuclear. I can't stop thinking about that, because advocating for a nuclear attack
we are behind
is really
you.
only in game for all of us, and definitely for the region. So, Stephanie, you're in Doha. You're based in Doha, but you're roving around. You're going to all of these different countries. What is the feeling amongst people when you're in the grocery store, when you're talking to colleagues, when you're talking to friends? Is this just ever present, this wider regional war?
It's dark. Yes, it's dark. People don't want to go out. They don't want to celebrate birthdays. Of course, a lot of people here are, Palestinian or Lebanese, and just the region in general. Gaza has, I think, I don't know how to explain it. Life has been sucked out of it in such a way. And then now with Lebanon, it's just one thing after the other, and it just gets worse. And like you were saying, the Americans keep saying, we don't want this to escalate into, where are we? We are already at the end for people. People have fled their homes in the tens of thousands. The south of Lebanon, Beirut is being pummeled. And I think it was really interesting. We had Gideon Levy on, one of the Israeli commentators, and he said it so well. It really stuck with me. I put it on my Instagram and it got so many hits, because he said, imagine if what Israel did in Lebanon, if it was the other way around. Imagine if Hezbollah blew up walkie-talkies in the hand of Israeli soldiers and reservists, killing 500. Imagine if it bombed the country that day. He said, what would the world call it?
Terror. This would be the definition, a very cruel terror. So why is it when Israel is using the same methods, the world accepts it, Israel is sure it's doing the most moral action in the world?
After the UN General Assembly speech, Ayman Safadi, the Jordanian foreign minister, said, Israel says this is about its survival. We, all of the Arab nations, guarantee Israel's survival if there is a Palestinian state. And this is the bottom line, Malika, here. He said, but Netanyahu and this government doesn't want it. He said, so what does that mean? Wars, wars, wars. And he's right. We've covered Gaza wars throughout the last 20 years. I've been there. And it's the bottom line is if there isn't a political solution to that, then, it's just gonna escalate. And at this point, unfortunately, we are at a point, we're past all the red lines that there used to be. Mm-hmm. We as journalists used to be able to tell. Now we don't. Now we're like, all those red lines have crossed.
And that's The Take. If you want to watch more episodes like these, let us know in the comments down below, or give this episode a thumbs up. And remember to subscribe to the Al Jazeera English channel here on YouTube.